My name's Liam Delaney. I'm head of the Psychology and Behavioural Science Department here at LSE. It's a real pleasure and privilege to welcome people here in person at the LSE. Welcome to LSE, and people from all around the world online. Welcome today, for this is a really special occasion. I think I was just the first person to buy a copy of A Theory of Everyone, which cost me £22, which was money well spent, I think. So thank you to Michael for writing it. It's a really great occasion. Michael is my colleague here at LSE, and a very valued colleague. He's written some of the most interesting papers, I think, in social science in the last decade. So this book, while being a real page-turner, it's written at such a brilliant pace. It's also based on real scholarship. I mean, really interesting ideas around human cultural evolution. I did smile a little bit. I think at some point in the last 10 years, as an emerging scholar, someone would have sat Michael down and said, you know, you need to focus on a particularly, a narrow area of psychology, learn more and more about it. And he clearly wasn't listening, or he heard something different from that conversation. So we've got a theory of everyone, who we are, how we got here, and where we're going. But I think there's a serious point. He's drawing from, as I said, real scholarship on cultural evolution, and we need people that get out and talk about some of these issues, how humans are going to cooperate across the globe in the face of some of the major challenges that we face. I think it's fair to say Michael presents a very optimistic vision, or at least puts forward some very optimistic thoughts on how cultural evolution will work. I think there'll be many audiences for this book. I think there'll be many debates around policy. I think one thing that brought a smile to my face when I read it is I could picture a 14 or a 15-year-old picking up this book and just getting excited about social science, about psychology, about its contribution to the world. And it's written in really the great tradition of complex ideas being translated to broad audiences. So thank you very much, Michael. It's an absolutely superb book. And I'd also like to welcome Matthew Syed, who will need not much introduction to most of you. So Matthew's a very well-known, very well-respected broadcaster, science writer, and international champion table tennis player, which I learned today when I was researching him.
I'm glad I don't call it ping pong. Occasionally I'll get it, it makes it sound like a parlour game. We know it's a globally competitive sport, right?
And yes, and has written many best-selling books, including Rebel Ideas, which is outside. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Michael to introduce his book. And as I said, I'm absolutely thrilled at this occasion to launch it here at LSE. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Is there a clicker? Is there a clicker? Oh, here. All right, amazing. Thank you so much for coming. You know, when you write a book, it takes you a long time. It took me 3 years. The pandemic got in the way. You put it out there and you don't know how it's going to be received. You have no idea. You know, you'll have a launch event and maybe, your grad students and postdocs and lab turn up and that's it. It's so wonderful to see so many people, and thank you so much for all coming. So, as Liam alluded, the title of the book is A Theory of Everyone. Very narrow, limited scope, as you can tell. One of the pieces of advice I got when writing a book is to not write a book because you feel like it's that time in your career, or it's like it's a thing you want to do, you want to try to make some money. Terrible idea to make money, actually. Write a book when it's bursting out of you, when you can't not write the book, when you've got something to say and it's irritating you so much that if you didn't say it, like you're just lying awake at night, it's like, I just want people to know this stuff. That is what it felt like for the last 3 years getting this out, and that's what kind of propelled me to get it out. The message that I wanted to get across is that we are at a point in the social sciences, the human and social sciences, that is truly a revolution, where we now understand the world and we're able to separate sense from nonsense. We're able to make sense of chaos. And that means that we can begin to turn that science into technology. We can begin to think through policies. And the only way to see that is to kind of take a big picture, look across all of these disciplines who are kind of like feeling the elephant, feeling the trunk of the elephant, feeling its tail, feeling its tusk, and seeing different parts of it, but missing the elephant in the room, if you like, missing that big picture. And that's really what I wanted to convey in this book. So the book opens with a quote from the American novelist David Foster Wallace, who tells his story. He tells his story. It was part of a commencement address at Kenyon College. He says, there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" Now, in my field, cultural evolution, this quote is often invoked to describe culture, right? It's the water in which we swim. It's the things, the beliefs, the values, the assumptions that we make about the world that we never think about until we meet someone who comes from a different place, who is maybe from a different generation, and who holds very different assumptions about the world. And then we realize, oh, I notice the water. I notice some of these things that are really inside me and not a natural part of the world. But in this case, the quote isn't about culture, which is strange because I study culture. It's about something that's even more fundamental and arguably even more ignored. It refers to energy. So I should say a little bit, my background is a little bit strange in many different ways. I didn't start life, I started my educational career as an engineer. So I was thinking about these kinds of things. I was interested in applying psychological and behavioral science to engineering. I was an undisciplined scholar, if you like. I looked across disciplines and I was interested in. It was only this that I kind of noticed that a lot of the puzzles that we were dealing with in the human and social sciences actually required us to think about energy. And there's a particular graph that has obsessed me. It has obsessed me, it has bothered me, I've thought about it, it links to so many different things that I deal with in the world, and it is this graph here. This is a graph of human progress in pretty much any metric that you might care to graph, right? Life expectancy, child survival rates, GDP per capita, percentage of people not living in extreme poverty, our energy capture, living in a free society, whatever you want. And there's something really odd about this graph, right? If you look across this graph, so we got time on the x-axis here, and if you look across, all of those things that they forced you to learn about in school, so the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of Genghis Khan, the Black Death in Europe, the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the graph is flat. The graph is flat. And then suddenly, we hit the Industrial Revolution, and by every metric that we might care about, the graph shoots up into the sky. It flies off into infinity, and it makes, as Ian Morris, the famous historian Ian Morris puts it, it makes a mockery of everything that came before. Everything that came before was a blip in terms of any of these metrics. And that needs an explanation. In our everyday lives, we live in this world here, at the peak of this chart here. We no longer even think about it, right? This situation here, where I'm standing in a room full of strangers, is freaking weird. And I mean, it's weird along many metrics. So it's weird in terms of our species. If this was a room full of chimps, this would be a room full of maimed and dead chimps. If this was 200 years ago even, this would be odd. We're from different places in the world. The LSE is a very diverse place. It would be dangerous, let's put it that way, right? There would be threats in the air. And geographically, it is still strange today. So I can give this talk here at the LSE in the UK. I can give this talk in Australia, Austria. But in the Congo or Afghanistan, there are places where this might be a dangerous thing to do, to just gather a bunch of strangers into a room together. So Steven Pinker and others have described this as the decline in violence, the rise in cooperation. And there are various explanations, but none of them really sit. There are various explanations that say something like Enlightenment values, or it's simply that we're intelligent enough to realize that by working together we can get more. But if we were intelligent enough, why did it take so long? And why did it happen so quickly? The book tackles this problem. It answers that question. And then it says, what can we do with those answers to face the world that we live in today? At the center of this book are 4 laws of life. I did a podcast recently. It was with a physicist, Mindscape, and Sean Carroll. And I had to apologize. These are not Newtonian laws. These are lenses with which to view the world, right? But they are fundamental, and they apply just as much to bacteria as businesses, from cells to societies. And these 4 laws are the law of energy. What really happened in the Industrial Revolution was an energy revolution, the likes of which we had not seen since the Agricultural Revolution, and before that, fire. These revolutions unlock copious amounts of energy and allow us to multiply human ingenuity. Everything that we do today, your ability to come here to this lecture, cross in cars, in planes, in trains, all of that required energy. You literally, 4 billion people are alive today due to something called the Haber-Bosch process, which takes nitrogen from the air and hydrogen in natural gas and turns it into ammonia and literally produces food that half the planet is alive thanks to that. We're eating our fossil fuels. What we discovered was stored solar energy. So plants, through photosynthesis, converted this to chemical energy. It was compressed into dense batteries. Peat turned to black rock and coal. Algae and zooplankton turned into oil and natural gas. And we used that energy in the Industrial Revolution to multiply our efforts. Everything that we could do faster, we could do it better, and it incentivized us to work together. Because by working together, we could create our greatest achievements and also our worst atrocities. We could outcompete, we could colonize, we could exploit one another. So that's the law of energy, and it describes the ceiling on human progress. Underneath that is the law of innovation. So we discovered these technologies, but we also discovered ways to use that energy more efficiently. In fact, when energy is present, it allows us to discover ways to, light bulbs, for example, right? You know how often one of the things you're supposed to do to save the environment is turn off the light? Have you heard this before? Don't. Just leave it on. It doesn't matter. LEDs at this point are so efficient, they're close to 100% efficient, that they are blips. They mean nothing, actually, relative to even a single flight across to anywhere. Yeah? We use energy more efficiently. We do more with less. But there's a limit to that. There's a limit to innovation. At some point, there's a certain amount of joules, a certain amount of watts that's required to keep a room hot, that's required to drive a car, that's required to produce food, tractors and so on. But the law of innovation says that we find ways to use that energy that is available to us, that excess energy. The law of innovation and the law of energy together create a space of the possible. You can think about it as like a ceiling and a floor. And within that space, there's a process by which we learn to develop technologies, but also to work together, to cooperate in ever larger groups. The law of cooperation says that the scale at which we work together is the scale at which the per cell or the per person level of energy is higher than it would be in a larger group or a smaller group. If I wanted to start a project, for example, I would love to write all those papers by myself and win a Nobel Prize. But if I'm a physicist and I need a large hadron collider, I'm going to need thousands of people. I would love to start a business and keep all the equity for myself, but I can't. I have to work with other people. I need employees. I need to work with suppliers. I need to take funders to help secure all this, right? So the law of cooperation says that is the level. Now, we don't always reach that level, but that is the maximum level of cooperation one would expect in that system, defined by that space of the possible. And the final law, the law of evolution, says that the way that we navigate this space, either as cells outcompeting other cells as they grow into organisms and animals, or as societies of companies and countries and governments and so on, is through this evolutionary, genetic and cultural evolutionary process. That we discover ways that we can work together. We discover constitutions. We discover that liberal democracy might work better than an autocracy under most conditions, and so on. These four laws together, as I said, apply at every scale we find. But I'm mostly interested in the human scale. I'm interested in what's going on in society. In part one of the book, I go through these laws of life, and I describe the human animal, us, how it is that a chimp-like common ancestor 5 to 7 million years ago went down a very different trajectory and became a new kind of animal. I describe what that says about human intelligence and the way that intelligence has been growing and expanding and going up, now kind of plateauing. The way in which those brains designed for learning from one another innovate in a particular way, how we are created by culture, and the way that we work together at different scales. At the core of what it means to be this new kind of animal is a theory that's referred to as dual inheritance theory, gene-culture coevolution, cultural evolution, the extended evolutionary synthesis. It goes under different names, but the thrust of it is this. All animals on Earth, when they discover a new environment, use genes, genetic evolution, to survive. And they figure things out over the course of their lives. So genetic evolution works like this. Think of human skin color, right? It's well adapted to latitude, the amount of UV radiation. If you're in a northern latitude, you want to lose some of that melanin so that you get enough sunlight, so that you synthesize enough vitamin D. There's not a lot of sunlight in Norway. If you're in Australia, you want to protect yourself from skin cancer. You don't solve that through individual learning, like going out in the sun or not. It's a genetic solution. Animals also learn through individual learning. You figure out that the water is here, the water is there, the food is here, and so on. Okay? But humans have a new way of learning. We learn from one another, and we learn from the accumulated knowledge over thousands and thousands of years that you discover at school, through your society, at universities like this. I'll give you an example of this software. So another way to say this is that the secret to human success is not in our hardware. Just as much as if you want to understand Excel or you want to understand ChatGPT, you don't look in the CPU or the GPU, you have to look in the software. If you want to understand human intelligence, you have to look in your software. And then you need to think about how that software is written and how it can be improved and upgraded. Here's an example. You assume many things about people, that we can reason, that we can count. But many of these features are actually delivered to us by our education system. Take counting, for example. Many societies today and over history would count like this: 1, 2, 3, many. And then we found a way of counting by using just what I did there, body parts like fingers. There are many different cultures that have different counting systems. We use 10 because of our 10 fingers. It's not a great number, to be honest. 16 would be better because it maps back to decimal. There's nothing special about 10. We also use stones, think calculus, limestone, right, as a way to count. And we put notches into clay. But we had a metaphor for numbers, or at least natural numbers. But 0 isn't obvious on your body. Where is 0, right? 0 stones is 0 of everything else. So it took centuries before we went from that to discovering the concept of 0. And it wasn't until the 17th and 18th century that negative numbers became obvious. And to do that, we used a number line. We had to move away from objects, and we moved to a movement and position on a number line, which made obvious not only 0, but negative numbers, and later an orthogonal line to create things like a complex plane. Many things about us. Have you ever taken the Stroop test, where you have to say the colors of words? Have you ever seen this before? If you were a psychologist from Venus and you came down to Earth and you saw this, you would say, literacy is a human instinct, but color perception is not, and you would be wrong. That is part of your software. We know for a fact that's learned, but so too is numeracy, so too is much of our reason, so too is much of our intelligence. As that body of knowledge that we acquired from accumulated wisdom from our parents and grandparents and eventually our schools and books and so on accumulated, our brains got so large that they became too difficult to birth. We couldn't give birth to these brains anymore. And that completely changed our society. It's like the curse of Eve. We ate from the tree of knowledge and birth became too difficult. So this is, for example, a chimp, head size versus the birth canal. No problem. This is apharensis. You can start to see it's getting a little bigger. For humans, you can see you have to compress that thing and squeeze it out. You should thank your mothers. It was an incredible feat that they went through to create you. It was incredible. Now, if you look even today, just to show you what a feat that is, this is some data from the medical literature. Doctors used to think that, big babies were difficult to birth, or maybe it was totally random. It turns out it is big heads. So this is a graph of the probability of an emergency intervention, such as an emergency cesarean or an emergency instrumental birth. And on the bottom is head circumference as a percentile. And you can see that once you hit about the 85th percentile, it just shoots off into space, right? Bigger heads are more difficult to birth, and that also shows you that bigger heads are great if you can birth them. There is a small correlation with the ability to store and manage information. But that wasn't the only way that humans did this. We extended our childhoods, right? We extended our childhoods to the point where today, right, we've delayed it so that now it's not so much giving birth to a bigger head. Caesareans kind of relax that selection pressure. It's the ability to give birth at a later age. We did other things as well. We divided up the knowledge. We divided up the knowledge and became really clever at one small portion of the world and stupid at everything else. If civilization broke down and I suddenly had to fix cars or work in a massage clinic or whatever, I would struggle. I wouldn't get paid very well at all, right? Because we specialize, and that created a collective brain. Although each of us is very specialized, as a collective, we are brilliant and we're able to innovate. But we innovate through, if you like, crowd computing. We innovate by deferring the computation to the collective, where we are seeking out bits of information, gathering them in our heads, and something new is born. Ideas having sex, as Matt Ridley puts it. But underneath all of this, underneath this intelligence process, underneath this cooperation, underneath all of this remains energy. Because with energy, it is worth getting together, mining. This country launched the Industrial Revolution on the back of cheap and available coal, easy and close to the ground. And it used that to create the largest empire the world had ever seen. It was kind of late to the empire game. It created the largest empire the world had ever seen. I'm speaking to you in English, not just because I'm in England. Many people around the world speak English. And it was on the back of energy that that happened. It paid to work together to use that to exploit horrifically other parts of the world with less energy and less cooperative. And it completely reshaped our world. Because our economy is not a perpetual motion machine consisting of what you buy and the money you earn going in a perpetual cycle. It has inputs and it has outputs, and those inputs and outputs are fundamentally energy. There is a particular metric in the energy sciences that should freak you out, that should cause you to be very worried, and that can explain the brokenness of the world that we find ourselves in. That can explain why it is that things have become so difficult, why it is that it feels like America is teetering, one of the world's most successful democracies, why it feels like this country is not as good as it used to be. It's kind of like Great Britain to okay Britain, I guess. Right? There's a metric, and it is called energy return on investment. It is the amount of energy it is required to get some amount of energy back. Energy output divided by energy input. It is a metric of excess energy, how much energy you get from a system. And if you look at the energy return on investment of our current energy technologies, they all look like a stat that I'm about to give you. This particular stat comes from oil discovery, but they all look like this. In 1919, 1 barrel of oil got you another 1,000 barrels. That means there's lots of excess energy, which means there's lots of innovation, which means things are cheap. We used to be able to take helicopter flights very cheaply until the price of oil went way up in the 1970s and 80s. By 1950, 1 barrel of oil found you another 100. And by 2010, 1 barrel of oil found you another 5. Once you reach about 3, what you want is a world in which the energy sector is small and the non-energy sector, all the stuff that we do with all of that excess energy, is large. The holidays, the time with your friends, the amazing eating experiences, all of that stuff is large. But as our energy sector grows, it becomes more and more difficult to get energy. The economic growth slows down, everything becomes more difficult. And that is the world that we find ourselves in. I'll give you an example of how this affects things like polarization and the fracturing of our societies. Right? I want you to imagine that economic growth is kind of like buses coming along. Okay? In this case, buses are running on energy, so the analogy works nicely. Imagine they're coming every 5 minutes. Okay? And you're waiting in a queue. You're waiting in a queue, and you're kind of annoyed. Why is it that some people, the 1%, seem to have these bus passes that always get them to the front of the line? Why is it that some groups are allowing other groups in front of them? They might be ethnic groups, unions, occupational groups, whatever. Why is it that they're cooperating among themselves? But you know what? As long as buses are coming every 5 minutes and you're going to get a seat, you just mumble and grumble and you stay in line. But what happens when the rate of buses slows down? What happens when Eroy falls? What happens when those buses, one every hour, one every day? You better believe that that mumbling and grumbling becomes something more. The premise of this book is that underneath all of these specific solutions discovered by specific disciplines is a common cause. I make fun of books that I call toty books, the one thing that explains everything. This isn't a toty book. This is really about the way that a bunch of different things are related to one another in an easily understood way. It is a periodic table of people. It is the human and social sciences moving from alchemy to chemistry and allowing us to create some real technologies. So in part 1 of the book, I describe this theory. I explain it. There are other books that do this. I try to do it as accessibly as possible. I want my kid's kindergarten teacher to be talking about this kind of stuff, right? Part 2 of the book.
Optimistic.
As you'll see from part 2, I am an optimist. I'm a realist and an optimist. The difference between a utopian optimist and a realist is the acceptance of constraints. The acceptance of where we are today and where we could be near us, rather than we need to burn the whole thing down and start again. That's the difference. Part 2 of the book is about where we can go from where we are today. How we can reach a better place with small changes, but that are aligned with this theory of everyone, with these laws of life, with this new understanding. Things that you and I can advocate for to leave a better world, not only for ourselves, but for our children and every Homo sapien to come from here on in. Chapter 7 is about how we reunite humanity, heal those fractures, and find ways to work together in multicultural, diverse societies where we're not at each other's throats or pretending not to be. Part 8 is about how we deal with governance in the 21st century. Democracies don't seem to work really well when we're not on the same page. If you're Denmark and you're like, of course socialized medicine is the way to go, then you just pick the best person. But if you're America and you were broken on those fundamental bases, or in this country, pick any issue you want, then you don't pick the best person, you have to pick your person. That's a very different psychology. How do we shatter the glass ceiling of inequality? As you'll see in the book, inequality isn't necessarily a problem. People don't care about unequal outcomes. We're not looking for equality in that sense, but what we do care about is fairness. What we do care about is that people have an opportunity. Have you ever heard the phrase that, or the saying that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not? You heard that before? It's not strictly true. Talent is not completely equally distributed. But let me tell you, opportunity is definitely not. There's a long way to go there. And there are changes that we can make to create a world where we're taxing, for example, unproductive money and not taxing income or sales or things that are productive, right? So that we're moving us to a better equilibrium. How do we trigger a creative explosion? Once we solve this problem of giving opportunities to more, think about the wasted talent all around the world. How do we bring those people to the table so that they can contribute or can invest in the things that push us forward, all of us, as a species? How do we create that next level of abundance? How do we improve the internet, deal with what I call the fourth line of information, AI, machine learning, as a way to aggregate information? So in addition to genes, in addition to culture, in addition to individual learning, how do we deal with AI? And how do we become brighter? So the book deals with a bunch of things. It is a big book. And honestly, what I would love is a discussion. I want people to engage with this. You know what? If I'm wrong, if you look at the endorsements for this book, it comes from across the board, from every discipline you can imagine. So I feel fairly comfortable at the facts. And if I'm wrong, hopefully I'm at the margins. But I would like a discussion around this. So what kind of technologies, what kind of energy technologies have the right amount of EROI to get us to the next level of human abundance? Because as you'll learn in the book, abundance turns to scarcity as populations grow. And then we need that next level. When we discovered agriculture, our populations grew, we pushed hunter-gatherers to the margins, and then agriculturalists began fighting with one another. It took millions of years for those solar batteries, fossil fuels, to charge, and we depleted them in a matter of centuries. There are only a few technologies that can do this, if you look at the numbers, really, if you do some back-of-the-envelope calculations. If you have hydropower, you've got large, fast-flowing rivers, please use them. They're amazing. They have very high EROI. Solar, maybe, if you can solve the battery issue. There is a fusion reactor in the sky, and if we can use it better, that's great. But nuclear fission, unfortunately, was kind of halted by fears of an earlier generation. But to judge modern nuclear technologies on the 1950s technologies is like judging cars and airplanes. You wouldn't fly and you wouldn't drive if cars were still the way they were in the 1950s. We've come a long way, and we've come a long way on this too. But really, the next level of human abundance is nuclear fusion. If we crack that and we begin to use the most abundant element in the universe, hydrogen, we would be the first generation of a galactic civilization. We would look to our descendants as backward as the Middle Ages looked to us. How do we build multicultural societies? How do we tackle what I call the paradox of diversity, which is that the elephant in the room is that diversity is the fuel for innovation. Immigrants are the lifeblood of a country. But diversity is divisive by definition. If we can't cross that divide and learn to talk to one another and learn to work with one another, then the fractures crack and society breaks and everything is worse for everyone. So I go through models like the mosaic model, the melting pot model, and the no-hyphen model, and I suggest that all of them are broken in one way and that they do not consider resources and energy, and what I call the umbrella model is a much better one. I deal with governance in the 21st century. I talk about the small changes we might be able to do now. For example, recreating systems that have worked, that have made America so innovative. Justice Brandeis referred to the states as laboratories. They try different things, And if it works, it bubbles to the top, and if it fails at a state level. Silicon Valley works the same way. It is not a bastion of success, it's a graveyard of failure. But the few successes, the Apples, the Amazons, the Alphabets, they pay for the rest. How do we design our societies in a similar way where we can reduce the risk and make it a local level and bubble up solutions to the top? Startup cities is a way to do that. It's too much to go into, but I hope you read the book and tell me more about that. And in the near-term future, let's say mid to near-term future, there are other more radical solutions like programmable politics. We talk about privilege a lot. One of the most underrated bits of privilege that I have seen as someone who has lived in Botswana, in Papua New Guinea, in Australia, Canada, the United States, and here, is passport privilege. I have multiple citizenships. I can travel almost anywhere in the world without a problem. And there are other people for whom a simple trip is a massive ordeal. And that is leaving money on the table. That is leaving talent, unable to attend the conferences, make the connections, and join our collective brain. And so there are ways past nation states that I describe. I talk about how we should be taxing. Income tax is fairly new, and this sounds radical, it sounds utopian, but if you follow the book, you'll see that certain taxes like income and sales are distortionary. They tend to make you work less or trade less. What you want are taxes on unproductive money, money that is just sitting there, right? Land value taxes, for example. Get rid of all of the others. There's a specific case to be made for that it could be a talk unto itself, but please read the book and take a look. And how do we make future generations smarter? Schools are stuck in a factory farmer model, as my wife puts it, right? Created for a time, it was literally the factory model, created for producing good factory workers. And we're still in that model. Why does it go from 9 to 3? Right? 3 o'clock? What's going on? Why are we learning things in our schools and testing things that are available in the little black boxes in our pockets? The world's knowledge is literally at your fingertips. That is not what we should be training kids. Kids, many parents realize this. The kids are not being prepared for the world as it is today, let alone the world as it will be tomorrow thanks to AI and machine learning. But there are ways past that. So I was recently in Estonia. I was talking to the former Minister for Education and some of the people in what was called the Tiger Leap, where they went from a country where half the country didn't have a telephone to the highest number of $1 billion unicorn companies per capita on the planet, and the highest performing students in mathematics, science, and reading in the Western world. How did they do that? They did it using these collective brain dynamics. I don't think they called it that way. They didn't think about it that way, but they're identical to wherever we see these innovative processes. It lines up with ideas like startup cities. It's putting the trust back into teachers' hands. It is solving the problem that Venki Ramakrishnan described. The A-level system is no longer fit for purpose. It solves that problem by giving greater autonomy to schools, but also creating incentives and sharing of knowledge. So I'm just going to quickly end. You can go check out some of the reactions from various scholars. You know, the danger when you trample over many fields is you get it wrong. So I sent it to experts, and I also got endorsements and just checked. You know, we have psychologists, we have historians, we have corruption policymakers, we have human evolutionary biologists, historians, archaeologists, energy scientists, CEOs, philosophers, business professors, and so on. Every discipline I touch on is covered. So I feel comfortable. The endorsement suggests that the book works, which means it really is showing you the bigger picture and how these things connect to one another. So thank you very much. You know, they wanted me to talk for an hour, and I was like, I want to hear from you guys. I would like questions. So please, I hope that this leads to a lively discussion. We've got folks online. Thank you so much for joining online. Thank you so much for coming. I would like to answer anything you have to ask. Thank you so much.
Technically chairing, but I got you and Matthew are going to just have an open chat to start.
You know, it's pretty free flowing. So if there are questions from the audience, if there's questions online, and if there's things you and I want to discuss, we'll play it by ear.
I feel slightly left out now.
Matthew, why don't you start?
I mean, given that I'm here to start, I mean, I think it's a marvelous book. I got a copy of it when I was on holiday here with my son, who's 9 years old, and decided to come today when he said, "What are you doing tonight, Dad?" And I said, "I'm going to Well, I thought I was going to have a conversation with Michael, but as it turned out, I was going to sit on a stage while other people are. And he said, but.
It's both.
He said, what?
Don't worry.
No,
we can chat. We can chat.
Are you hearing me? Are you working okay? And I said, I'm talking to somebody who I think has written one of the best non-fiction ideas books of the last 10 years. I got a copy of it when I was on holiday, and I read it in a very rapid pace, and realised immediately that it really subverts a lot of what we think about the world. The concept of EROI, Energy Return on Investment. I did an undergraduate degree in economics at Oxford University. Energy was not mentioned at all. And this is a London School of Economics. There must be economists in the room. And the Cobb-Douglas production function that we use to make sense of economic growth and a great deal of economic phenomena had a residual, the solo residual. But I think it left out 50% of the variance. But when you add energy to the equation, that variance is largely eliminated. I've just finished a visiting fellowship at All Souls, and a wonderful college, but there might be some of you listening, I've enjoyed it enormously, a very prestigious academic institution, but to this day, energy is really lacking as a variable in understanding the modern world. For me, I think it's changed a little with the Ukraine war, and we have noticed that the world has struggled with high gas and oil prices. But then it takes you to all of the other very interesting topics in Michael's book, the way he connects the energy surplus to psychology, polarization, which we're suffering in the world today. And, I think he does, to a large extent, take you by the hand and across the landscape of the modern world, and offers scintillating and empirically credible answers to some of these questions. Having said that, I do think it's worth tonight, am I right, challenging some of this stuff. Should we have a bit of that or not? Should we give him an easy ride, or should we? By the way, who is in the audience? Michael said it's a very intelligent audience, and I don't have my doubts. I can see the intellectual energy is oozing off you guys. But is it mainly graduates and undergraduates at the LSE, or is it a hands up if you're at the London School of Economics? It's basically incredibly intelligent people. Ted, you're the odd one out here, mate. No, you're not. You're going to get here. So, Michael, let me challenge you a little.
Sure.
Nervous.
This is unprepared. It's unscripted.
It is unscripted. But I think it's worth. You'll have coherent answers, I have no doubt.
Yeah.
I've given talks on Michael's book to academic audiences, and I'm kind of aware of the kind of pushbacks and the interesting questions that you're going to get when you go on Newsnight, and I hope on the Today programme to defend your arguments, which bring in topical issues. Did you see Suella Braverman yesterday on multiculturalism? There's a chapter on multiculturalism in the book. It's highly pertinent. But you mentioned, so EROI, let me just quickly, this is one good way. You did it, I think, better in the book. You've got, if I may say so.
The book is definitely better than the talk.
No, the talk was great. The talk was good. The talk was 9.9 out of 10. The book was, but you expend energy to get energy back, because you have to drill. And when we started getting oil, we got the easy stuff from near the surface. Now we're having to frack, refine tar sands. It's very energy intensive. So we're only getting 5 barrels back for every barrel expended in the extraction process. This is declining, what Michael calls the collapsing energy ceiling. But society runs on the net energy, the energy surplus that we gain after extract. Think of a cheetah. If the cheetah expends more energy chasing an antelope than it gets back from the meat of the kill, it's going to die eventually. That is the fundamental thermodynamic point that I think sits at the absolute heart of this book. But on the statistics that you put up there, you have nuclear fission at 75 to 1. I've become so interested in nuclear fission that I spent the day last week with the managing director of Hinkley Point C to go through the construction of a current nuclear fission station. But it struck me as I was walking around, and I'm going to let you back in now, that if nuclear fission is 75 to 1, and the European country that has built the most nuclear fission stations is France, you would expect its energy surplus to be driving growth of a kind that we wouldn't have seen during the Industrial Revolution and China wouldn't have seen during its rapid rise after the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. How do you explain that anomaly?
So, I mean, people often ask me, like, how do we map this back onto countries? And what matters is how much energy that you have access to. So the kind of arguments that I'm making in the book are about excess energy for our species as a whole. And if you're part of the EU and if you're part of France, you aren't just using all of that energy for yourself. You are having to sell it. You're having to deal with all of the problems that you have. And so it isn't a closed system. You shouldn't think about France as being a single unit that's trapping and using all of that energy. Sometimes you do, the fact that energy is so valuable and the fact that you have access to it can drive growth. For example, in this country, when, the coal mines were failing through the 60s and 70s, and it was really the discovery of North Sea oil that kind of rescued what was a decline for Britain until now, when that has kind of also run out. Now that added, something like 10% to the economy, but that wasn't the only thing going on, because you can buy energy on the open market. The case that I'm making is that as a society, as a world, we're running out of excess energy. Now you brought up nuclear, which is incidentally an interesting point, because nuclear is incredibly expensive to make. We don't seem to do it incredibly well, and the time horizon on the payback is very far. So there's two issues there. One is that if we don't have the energy and cooperative capacity to think on those time horizons, then we never make those investments. That's the problem. It's hard for a hunter-gatherer to make the move to industrialization. They need to kind of get to agriculture first, have all of that cooperative capacity, and then they kind of get there. There are other ways to do it. So Korea, for example, has been able to build nuclear power plants in the Middle East cheaply and quickly. China's got like about 228 nuclear reactors on the go. So clearly some portion of this is the regulatory environment that can be innovated on. But I think, to answer your original question, you shouldn't be looking at this as a country as a whole, unless you were using all of that energy for yourself.
But then it's a great answer, but
Yeah.
Does it not then raise the question, he says, trying to get a column idea for this Sunday, does it not raise the question of why France was not using this, and
Yeah.
the surplus? I mean, you're right. Britain, as I understand the argument, is using coal during the Industrial Revolution to wonderful curves. Am I right? All the way through the fall of Rome and the Black Death, and you've got this very shallow development of our species, and then it takes off with the surplus energy. And this starts it's effectively converting the stored solar energy to mechanical energy via the steam engine, and then
That's
later
right.
the electricity. But Britain, England, and Wales are using this coal for themselves.
Yeah.
Why did France not follow that model? Why did it Why did it sell it? Why didn't it just say, look, we've got this 75 surplus?
Yeah. So I mean, this is what I also mean, where it's not like the one thing that explains everything, right? Hunter-gatherers have been walking on fossil fuels,
Yep.
and there are many countries in Africa that are incredibly wealthy, energy wealthy, right? Russia too, for example, is incredibly energy wealthy, but that's not the only portion of this equation. The second half is the innovations with which you can use it. Sometimes those innovations come through from other places. So, for example, Shell or BP coming into a country and exploiting the natural resources of that country, cooperating as a company at the expense of a country that doesn't have that cooperative capacity. So if you look at economic growth models, there are kind of three terms, right? There is, the technology, there's the capital, and there's the labor. And those terms are kind of, let's say, fuzzy, or we can add some more to that when we start to think about culture. So you do need, for example, human capital. Like you do need education. You do need the software running in people's heads to have people working together to capture that and control that. So one story that I tell in the book is the story of how North Sea oil was used
compared to Norway.
That's right, exactly. Completely differently between Britain and Norway. Sorry. So Britain and Norway discover North Sea oil at roughly the same time. But Britain at the time was a deeply divided society along multiple lines, right? So after a long time, inheritance taxes were very high. The class system was starting to come apart, but it was on the rise again in the mid 20th century when that oil was discovered. There was also incredibly high levels of immigration to this country that weren't at the time. Britain hadn't found its new multicultural identity. There were horrendous interethnic conflicts, right? Things like, I think it was called Paki bashing and things like that, right? People ended up living in ethnic enclaves. So you had political polarization, you had class polarization, you had ethnic polarization. Now that was a very different story. When a country is so divided, it is difficult to make decisions that serve everybody rather than partisan in your particular group. Now contrast that with Norway, who discovered about the same amount of oil at roughly the same amount of time. They wanted to avoid what's called the resource curse, where discovering these kinds of resources actually make things worse because of that partisan divide. Those partisan groups begin to fight over that, and it destroys the country. It makes things worse. Many African nations suffer from this problem. Not all, but many. Right? Norway, in contrast, was a highly homogenous nation with far less class division, and so they made a decision to create what was called the 10 Oil Commandments, where that oil would be used to create the world's largest sovereign fund, and it could only be used for specific purposes like healthcare and education and roads, and could not be used for partisan purposes. Because they had this time horizon that was effectively infinite, Norway, when the 2008 crisis happened, they had such a large surplus that while everyone else was selling, they were able to buy up the stock market so that this tiny country, about the size of Los Angeles County, bought up 1.5% of the world's companies, 1.5% of the world's stock market. Today, every Norwegian is born with an inheritance of around $250,000. That's their baseline, that's their starting point. And Norwegians will be rich forever. They will be highly educated, so they'll have all the pieces that you talked about. They will have cooperation, they will have the education and human capital, and they can choose to use it as they wish because they also have that energy. Now, sorry, what I was going to say is, what that also means, of course, is that once that energy runs out, they'll have all those other pieces, right? If you've got all those pieces, you can buy, as long as you're cooperating with people and you're not cut off by, I don't know, Russia or something like that, you can buy it on the market and then you can use that. So what the argument here is about, it's a global argument. And what happens at the national level is a little bit more complicated.
But it's interesting. It is interesting that when Eroy is mentioned, people immediately move to a national analysis of growth.
That's right.
And it is plausible in the case of England during the Industrial Revolution.
Only because it was more isolated.
Yeah. Yes, but I think there are downstream questions about that. I mean, just one thing, yeah. The P word, honestly, right? If you use that on the radio, you get cancelled these days.
Is that about right?
By the way,
I'm not from here.
I'm half Pakistani, so I can say that. That's okay, but I just want to warn you if this happens in the future.
South Asian, that's good.
But I was glad to see no one looked as if they were going to walk out at that stage. You gave them the benefit of the doubt. I'm glad. By the way, let's talk about. No, let's not talk about cancel. Do we want to talk about cancel culture? Is this? Are we bored of this now? Are you interested in it? Bored or interested? Bored. We're bored of cancel. You want to cancel me? Let me ask you about the other thing that I think is quite an interesting anomaly. Michael's argument is that the innovative capacity of a society is a function of the net or surplus energy and the size of the population and the interconnectedness. Mm-hmm. What he and Joe Henrich in their wonderful paper call the collective brain. Wonderful paper, Innovation in the Collective Brain, but it's all covered in this book. Now, you would have thought, would you not, that the internet is connecting lots of brains all around the world in a way that was completely unimaginable 50 years ago. We can share ideas and cross-pollinate concepts and connect with people that we would never meet in the physical world. And yet it seems to me that innovation hasn't really increased. There's a famous quote by, I think it's Paul Krugman, what is the quote, Leah? Do you remember? It's something
we
see
the
influence of the internet everywhere except the productivity figures.
Right, yeah.
Now, what is your explanation for this?
Yeah, so that's right. So I wouldn't say that innovation, so there has been what Tyler Cowen calls the great stagnation, right? We're not seeing these effects on total factor productivity. And that's not to say there isn't innovation. There's been incredible innovation, right? Grandparents can talk to their grandchildren across the planet. I use ChatGPT and large language models and AI every day, right? Yeah, I do. There's been, and I talk a little bit about it in the book, but yeah, there have been massive innovations, but we don't see it in productivity. You're right. And that is because fundamentally there are two kinds of technological innovations. There are those that improve efficiency, if you like, and the productivity is going up. It's just the rate at which it's going up is slow, right? So it's slowing down basically. Because there's a limit to how efficient you can get. So in the book I talk about my personal obsession with efficiency in my personal life, how I balance trying to be a good academic, a good father, a good spouse, against all of the competing concerns in life.
There's a lot of skepticism from Michael's wife in the front row here.
A little bit more on that beta value. But it's a microcosm of what we can do, right? At the end of the day, I only have 24 hours in a day, right? And I need 8 for sleep. I just need 8 for sleep. I try to have efficient relaxation, but I need to relax, right, at times. This is also true in society, right? There's a fundamental limit to efficiency. At the end of the day, as I said, there's a certain number of joules or watts or however you want to call it to heat a room. There's a certain amount of energy that's needed to catch you across the planet. And so although there are these innovations, they are not energy innovations. What drives that productivity are either these massive leaps in innovation because we're at that first era where there are big efficiency gains to be made, like, for example, the price of solar right now, solar panels, nicely. We're in that early stage curve, but it's going to slow down, right? Which is different to an energy innovation. So for our species, unlocking fire, as I said, was the first major. We grew our brains and shrunk our guts. We require cooked food today. And that's because we discovered fire. We could outsource detoxification, the bioavailability of foods, if you like, right? The next major unlocking was another solar technology. It was agriculture. Rather than wasting all that time hunting and gathering and walking around and roaming, we could stay in one place, make it all happen intensively, and we grew our populations on the back of that. We were less healthy, we were shorter, but we outcompeted hunter-gatherers because we grew massively. And the next major unlocking that truly drove productivity was the Industrial Revolution. I argue there's really only one Industrial Revolution, not 4. The others were just kind of shadows of the first, right? What we might be going through today, I disagree that we're not going through an innovation period. We definitely are. What I argue we're going through today in the book is a second enlightenment. Just as the first enlightenment was this connectivity as we never saw before, thanks to coffee houses, thanks to pamphlets being shared, thanks to philosophical and political arguments where people were at each other's throats in those coffee shops, we see the same thing today. We see it on Twitter. What's it called now? X, right? We see it in Facebook groups. We see it on Substacks, right? We see it on social media and the internet. We are going through a second enlightenment. The question is, will that second enlightenment lead to a true second industrial revolution that will actually drive up productivity?
So am I right in paraphrasing that if the energy ceiling is declining at, say, 10% a year and efficiency is rising at 10% a year, you get a net zero on productivity?
That's right.
Okay. So the argument would be, therefore, that if we connect the surplus energy of nuclear fission at 75 to 1, with the internet, then we will see.
Correct.
Correct. Just explain how that happens. What is happening to the connections between these brains? Let's just imagine for a moment that we're living in a nuclear fission age. Presumably, we're still going to be in here with lights and microphones and people and connectivity. What is happening at a granular level to drive massive efficiency gains in production?
We have the resources to remove the frictions. You don't have to do everything yourself, right? Think about how much time a washing machine or a dishwasher saves you, right? Think about how easy it is if it were cheap enough to just fly across the world for a quick meeting and then come back, right? Think about how much easier it would be if you had machines doing almost everything for you, because the energy cost is just that low.
Okay.
Now you've got all of that extra time that you can put forward to doing what you want to do anyway, right? The invisible hand, if you like, working for yourself or whatever. It allows you, it removes all of those frictions. And that productivity is driven by that multiplier effect. There was a Buckminster Fuller, he called them as kind of like energy slaves. If you imagine yourself, he imagined himself in traffic. And he imagined all of the things happening around him being done by people or by animals. Right? Think of your car being pulled by 50. How many horsepower is your car? 250 or something? 250 horses driving for a month. Imagine humans carrying out all of those tasks that the cranes are doing. How much slower is everything? The productivity is driven by that energy availability, put to good use by human ingenuity.
Michael, do you want to tap into the collective wisdom of the crowd? Will we take maybe one round from the audience? And,
we can come back and go back and forth.
Ellie, are you out there?
Please.
Yeah, and if you keep an eye on the chat. So maybe if we could just take a few questions, if anyone wants to start. Yes, yourself there in the white top. Yep.
Hello. Okay.
Hi.
First of all, thank you, Michael, for the talk. I think it was really inspiring, and I'm really looking forward to read your book. Although I feel like there's a giant elephant in the room that we haven't touched upon, and that's the Earth is burning. And I'm wondering how trying to increase our EROD scores or trying to have more excess energy that will drive innovation and cooperation, etc., will actually mean in terms of the climate catastrophe that we're living in right now.
Michael, do you want to take it one at a time, or do you want to take a few?
Can I take that one? Because it is a wonderful question. I love it. What's your name, sorry?
I'm Lucia.
Amizia?
Lucia.
Oh, Lucia. Lucia, thank you so much. Yeah, so I deal with this in the book, right? Conservation is easier when you have greater resources and you have more energy. The cleanest countries in the world are the wealthiest countries. Because then you have the resources to not have to cut down your forests to feed your population and have hospitals working. You don't have to burn if you're Australia, you can rejuvenate the Great Barrier Reef. I was there recently after, not being there for 15 years or something, and it was amazing, the amount they had invested in that, right? When you have that level of resources, you have the power to direct it in any direction you want, including sequestering carbon, desalinating water, rejuvenating plants, whatever you want to do, you can do that. The dangers that I see in sustainability and ideas like degrowth is that they will incentivize a zero-sum world. They will fix the size of the pie such that anyone's gain is someone else's loss. If you look at Piketty's work, for example, economic growth leads to less inequality, right? You can truly make something new. You can expand the space of the possible, as I call it, through that innovation in that world in a way that a fixed degrowth, sustainable, whatever, is stagnation and zero-sumness. So the way out of the climate mess, in my view, is not cutting back. It's energy abundance. It's the next level of energy abundance so that we can grow. We can perhaps leave the planet. We can begin to mine asteroids. We can do whatever we want. We can re-green the planet, but that is a function of greater wealth, not less. So that's the answer. It's in much more detail in the book. But that's the answer.
Let me just throw in a supplement, if I may.
Yeah.
Would you agree that in order to make things, you need material?
Correct.
And there is a limited amount of material on planet Earth.
Correct.
And some of these things are very important for the energy transition,
Correct.
these rare earth elements, which is actually at the heart of the geopolitical instability in Africa. You've seen the coups across the Sahel and in the Democratic Republic of Congo and beyond.
Yeah.
This is a fundamental issue. The Ukraine war is really a resource war. Now, are you confident that as the economy grows and we need more material in order to build the things we need to provide the energy and secure the goods that we wish to consume, there'll be enough available resources on asteroids to fill the gap? Because
that wasn't the question I thought you were asking me, actually.
But that is one of the things you say in the book, and I've done a lot of background reading on this. I think it's an open and interesting question.
Correct. So the question, I'm going to answer the question that I thought you were going to ask, which is actually another important question. If you're not thinking of it, you should be. Which is, are we confident that we would use that greater energy capacity in ways that don't further destroy the planet? And that is a decision that we have to make. I think the norms are at least in place. But also the incentives too, right? We often do the cheapest thing. And we don't use actual enslaved labor or something like that because we use energy to do that work for us. right? So you can do things more cheaply than exploiting people if energy is that cheap, and so is technology. You can transition away from, instead of just blowing up the land and gathering things up in this cheap and dirty way, you can use that energy in more careful ways to mine in ways that are less destructive, if you like. But your second question is, are there enough resources on other asteroids? And we don't know. We don't know. We have some reason to believe that at least a few asteroids are filled with more minerals that we require than is present on Earth. Astonishing amounts, but this is the next frontier for our species, right? This is the next level. I would say that if we don't do that, we're screwed anyway. But I'm hopeful that because we know at least some of the asteroids do have resources available, it just leads to a brand new industry. Yeah.
Maybe take a round of questions this time, Michael. Would that be okay? Or, yeah.
Okay.
So just the gentleman in the back in the blue top. Yeah.
I'm gonna try writing these down then. And also, we should take some from online.
Yeah. Exactly.
Good evening. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. And generally, I think anyone who's courageous enough to write a book called The Theory of Everyone deserves a special recognition. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Could I please ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the concept of nation state in that world? Because what seems more realistic is that the nation state now seems to play a very important role in defining who we actually are. And maybe rather than believing in some utopian concept of cooperation of all species as Homo sapiens, it may be more realistic and pragmatic to actually get to the table and recognize that the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans, they may have their own differences as nation states, and that will allow us to achieve our net zero targets, stick to our Paris climate agreements, and solve the future crisis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Can I take a second question? Yes, yourself there. Sorry, my colour distinction is not great, but you have the blue shirt and the glasses, please.
Hi. I guess sort of leading on from the question before about sustainability and climate change, and sort of, I agree that we need more energy. We need to use it in a more efficient way. But are there any, I don't know, maybe you touched on it in the book, are there like some practical ways in which you go about, sort of getting this into practice? Like, how can we actually use energy more efficiently? How can we invest more into, nuclear fission or solar energy, especially in a developing context?
Yep.
And then also, like, on the sort of immediacy of the issue, like whether this is going to happen at the pace enough to, not screw over the world.
Yep.
And then one final question, just that gentleman at the end there. Yep.
Thank you very much. The nuclear fission is, they've been saying the same lies for over 30 years, saying they're eventually going to solve that particular problem, and been given billions of pounds in the meantime for very little actual real results. But the real thing is that oil industry, capitalism, is hell-bent on destroying this planet, and we've incentivized them to do that by profit. So they're incentivized to keep destroying this planet. So surely you must be proposing, if you want a productive future, that nationalisation of all the oil industries of the world, and instead of those trillions of pounds being given to themselves and whatever they do with that money, which is war generally, that money could be done to actually solve the horrors, which the pollution, lung disease, destruction of the planet. Would you agree nationalisation is a necessary measure? Thank you.
Great. So.
Yeah, sure. Why don't let me go backwards, actually, if that's okay. The thing about why I'm hopeful, especially about nuclear fusion, is for the first time we have a startup industry and vastly more resources put into it. It's one of those things, right? Like, until it happens, it happens. It may not. In the meantime, we have nuclear fission, we have SMRs, we have microreactors, we have technologies right here, right now that will get us through the gap, just not that level of abundance that we're going to reach. In terms of the investment in energy, what should we be investing in? What can we do right now? I think, as I said, nuclear fission is our best bet. And it doesn't have to be these giant plants, right? So there are new advancements in SMRs, so small modular reactors, which are, the size of a football stadium or a couple of football stadiums, versus and micro reactors, which are the size of a shipping container or a large family car, right? And these are not like new technologies. Like that's what powers submarines, nuclear submarines. That's what powers aircraft carriers. These are technologies that have been used in the military for a long time. They just haven't been put to use in the commercial world. So, there are clear paths that are what I call the adjacent possibilities in the book. Actually, I forgot to say something on the other thing. I'm not sure if nationalization is the way forward, but I think we can achieve the same thing through land value taxes, where people's use of resources, people's use of the land is heavily taxed and in its value. And as a natural consequence of that, the natural resources under the land will be taxed. On the final question is like, why, should we be focusing on nation states, or what role does the nation state play? I actually have something more radical to say about that. Many of us live in a world that nation states don't matter anymore. As I said, this kind of passport privilege where you can pretty much live anywhere in the world. I take nation states as a reality. I'm not proposing world government. In fact, what I do propose is the opposite, which is startup cities. Empowering cities to grow, empowering new people to create new cities, to learn from one another in a kind of startup ecosystem where the risk exists at the city level, but the benefits are shared widely. So really, many of us today live in cities, if you like. And I think the point at which we crossed more urban rather than rural is 2007. And by 2050, the vast majority of us will be living in cities. So giving cities greater autonomy to try to work things out, while also cooperating at a higher scale through nation states and unions of nation states are better. Now, the details of how you arrange that are very interesting. So I refer to China, I get in a little bit of trouble because, sometimes people don't like if you're positive, you say anything positive about China. But, I refer to China as a kind of democracy by assent rather than democracy by selection. It's unclear if people are very good at selecting leaders, but China, obviously suppresses people and so on. There's all kinds of terrible things to say about China. But if I were to say like one good thing, I would say that they have interesting policies that allow local level solutions to bubble to the top by, for example, civil examinations, by, for example, incentivizing local leaders, if they succeed, to rise up through the Communist Party. And as long as the CCP is afraid of the people rising up, they're going to go in one of two directions. They're either going to try to push for greater economic growth, or they're going to do something far more destructive. And so the hope is that they push toward greater economic growth. Unclear. One cheeky thing I guess I say in the book, which I will say here, is that if you actually look at the United States versus China, the main difference is one party versus two. Because in the United States, if you want to make change on the left, you have to change the Democratic Party. If you want to make change on the right, you have to change the Republican Party. And those dynamics are not dissimilar to changing the CCP. There are better democratic models that are described in the book, preferential voting systems, for example, that are more representative of a greater number of people rather than vocal, well-coordinated minorities. There's much more I could say on that, but it's in the book, I guess.
I think that was already that was quite a lot, Michael. So, Ellie, do you have some questions from online? Yeah, just to bring folks in from the collective mind around the world.
Hi, so these are some of the questions from online. So one of them is, in A Theory of Everyone, you posit that the need for energy is a foundational law of life. While this may be true on a global scale, how do you reconcile this with the localized social and economic inequalities that often arise from resource extraction within national boundaries?
I mean, I kind of answered that. That's Sumaya, by the way, who is my excellent social media assistant and one of our talented students in the department. I kind of answered that before, which is that at a national level, all of these other dynamics are playing out, right? So the information that is in people's heads, the education systems, the level of cooperation, and so on. So take Russia, for example, very energy wealthy. And it's not the case that Putin is carrying oil fields in his pockets, right? It's not the case that an autocrat is literally controlling these things. What an autocrat is doing is using those resources by the law of cooperation to cooperate at a higher scale than the population is able to engage in collective action to depose them. And so, if you like, Putin is paying his supporters, who are then paying their supporters, onward into this kind of patronage network of cooperation, suppressing and leaving the vast majority of people poor. And that insight from the law of cooperation and energy leads to some interesting implications for things like foreign aid. Often what's missing from countries is the kind of competition that would lead to higher scales of cooperation and greater opportunities for people. But it's hard to escape that, and instead the foreign aid is used by the incumbent party to maintain their power at the expense of the vast majority of people who remain poor. So in other words, oil companies come in, they cooperate with a small group of elites. Those elites are better off. They use that money to support their supporters and their supporters. Foreign aid assists with that too, and the countries remain poor and trapped in a resource trap.
Yeah, maybe take another one from online if you have one.
Yeah, so another question from Adrian Lee online is, what role does AI play in the future of energy management?
So I mean, my hope is that AI really represents a fourth line of information that is able to kind of aggregate across all of human learning. And so in that sense, it might increase the pace of innovation, supercharge our collective brain, if you like, and hopefully lead us to some of those energy breakthroughs. But there's a lot of reasons why we may or may not be incentivized to use them in that way. I think I'm just going to leave that there because there's a lot one could say. By the way, Matthew, if you want to jump in at any point, please do.
Well, AI, yeah, I'm pretty nervous about it myself. I mean, I'd love to. I mean, first of all, I was struggling to read the audience there on the on one of the answers you gave, Michael. What was it on now? On China and the United States, the difference is China has. I mean, it looked as if you agreed with this, that the fundamental difference was. Was there any dissent in the room, or you just? I'm not sure I quite agree with that. On the nation state, I think we underestimate in the world today. Michael and his colleague Joe Henrik have written extremely persuasively about the development of cooperation through time. Hunter-gatherers giving way to clans and tribes after the development of agriculture, effectively cemented through kin, rituals, ancestor gods, these different ways to unify people who don't share sufficient genes to drive that kind of cooperation, but were able to do so in the context of intergroup competition. Now, I think the nation state is a miracle of the modern world, that we're bringing very large numbers of people to solve collective problems at scale. And I think we forget my father's Pakistani and my mum's Welsh, quite an unusual background, but I was born here. And we, I think it's fair to say, got rid of the indigenous tribes reasonably early through intermarriage. The ban on cousin marriage, I think, was a very big part of that. If I'm moving too fast, let me know. But effectively, this forced people to marry across tribal lines, and it unified the nation. We had a common currency in the 11th century, standard weights and measures. Obviously, there was economic inequality, but there was an emerging national identity reasonably early. I think it is highly improbable that we'll move to a world government without massive risks to the world from the concentration of power within a single elite.
I agree, by the way.
But I also fear that many of we're interested in Michael's view on this, that we have reached a stage in civilizational trajectory where many of our problems are collective action problems expressed at the level of the whole world. AI is a classic example. We used to have bows and arrows, so individuals could kill small groups of other individuals. Now we have something that could potentially destroy the world. A lot of experts in AI feel this. But if we try and combine to create a moratorium, call me cynical, but I think it's possible that one nation state would go rogue, develop their technology, and then turn on everyone else. Almost all of our major challenges in the world today are free rider, collective action problems expressed at the level of the world. And I don't see, myself, less optimistic than Michael, a very clear route out of this impasse. And I think that it is not impossible that after 250,000 years of our species, we're entering what could be the last few paragraphs of the story. If anyone can tell me a plausible explanation of how we escape from that fundamental issue, Michael can kick off.
I mean, in part 2 of the book, I do describe that is one possible scenario, but the one that I would very much like to avoid for all our sakes. And that is what part 2 is about. It's like how might we avoid that? I think one of the things is what if your solution or your model of change requires a massive shift in human nature or a violation of fundamental evolutionary principles, you've lost from before you've even started, right? Communism is probably a good example of this, right? You're lost before you've started, or it's going to require atrocious amounts of control in order to kind of push this vision that you have of the world. In the book, I describe one of the reasons that I switched from kind of engineering to working on the problem of culture and human behavior. I watched Al Gore's documentary in 2007, An Inconvenient Truth. And I started reading the IPCC reports, I started reading the Pentagon reports, and I bought it. I was like, climate change is a serious threat, and everybody is so focused on mitigation. But are we really going to slow the economy to save the planet? It just seems to me that in a world in which every country is trying to outcompete every other country, every company is trying to outcompete every other company, and everybody wants more than their neighbors, no amount of finger wagging was going to work. No amount of documentaries was going to take us to where we needed to be. And so it was great, we should try, of course, but just as much as that, we should be thinking about climate preparation, right? What does it mean to live in a climate change world? How do we save civilization when millions of people are underwater and displaced? When 1 million Bangladeshis are underwater and streaming into India, how does India react to that? What happens to Pakistan, the Middle East, and then Europe, right? How do we handle that? Do we have the cultural technologies, the behavioral science to be able to preserve our ability to govern and work together under those kinds of conditions? That's the issue in the book, right? So I think what we need is greater alignment, and it is almost impossible to do under conditions of resource constraints. Because when we compete with one another, the scale at which we end up cooperating depends on the scale at which when we work together, what I can unlock in this sized company or this sized project is larger than what I could get by myself in a smaller group or even in a larger group. And so the path out, Matthew, I think is clean growth, where we have enough abundance that we are incentivized to work like we are competing with each other in dirty ways because that's what we have access to. But would you not like to live in a clean...
Do you know, look, you can see I've absorbed the book, I hope in great detail, and I think it's a entirely plausible argument that with more net energy, we can cooperate to unlock more together, even when divided by the number of competing individuals than we could ever get on our own. Do you see that logic? The more energy we've got, the more we can extract by work.
Think of an organism, right? It can grow, and when it's under-resourced, so it doesn't have enough food, that's when the lower scales, the bacteria, the cancers begin to win. When it doesn't have enough resources, it's outcompeted by other animals fighting with it who are more energy rich.
And by the way, I mean, the scale of the book is incredible, because you look at the research on cancer now, where they are beginning to look at it as an evolutionary system, not single somatic mutations, but cooperative groups of small cells that are effectively working together to hijack the shared lifeblood of the bigger organism. Because our bodies are multicellular.
You're an Amazon rainforest,
right? Trillions of cells. So I mean, let me say that I'm going to have to go with it. My son's got to get the 820 from all of. But you know, I want if I could leave you. Okay, one question though on this. I've been thinking about it a lot. Is you would have thought as the energy got bigger, we would get higher scales of cooperation. We did, but think about European states. So Germany unified in the late 19th century, Italy did do. So it's going to be part of your argument. But there was ferocious warfare at the same time. So you're going to say that it's a higher scale of warfare. Okay,
that's right.
All right. Exactly. So then let me, which I think is a plausible. I mean, there are some anomalies with that, but
I'll say something really quickly about that. Which is, counter the story of a decline in violence and World War I and World War II and other things as blips. Yeah. They're part of the same process. Because, do you remember in 2001, we were all like, oh my God, religion, it's like just, it's all about destruction. We need to get rid of religion. It's a huge mistake, actually, to think about it that way. Every scale of cooperation is also a scale of conflict. We are a competitive species. We compete with one another, and then we cooperate to compete with one another, just at a higher scale. We used to be families against families, groups against kin groups, princedoms against princedoms, tribes against tribes, kingdoms against kingdoms, nation states against nation states, and now large unions of nation states bound by a common religious and cultural history against other large unions of nation states bound by a common. Which means the world today is more peaceful, but also more dangerous.
Because if there is a next conflict, it will be much larger.
One thing I think that sometimes, when you think about competition, some types of competition are really forms of cooperation. If you compete within a set of rules, that's one thing that I think it's quite difficult to unpick. I want to leave you with this, okay? Because you stay. I'm going to take Ted. 2 minutes, right? I want to leave you with this. Is a really important thought, and I should have made this clear at the beginning. I genuinely think it's impossible to understand the world. The world is complex. If you think about what is happening, we've talked today about AI, multiculturalism, energy, the transition, climate change, cooperation, polarization, what people are calling political decadence in the West. I think it's a fair criticism. There are no books out there that really are capable of providing a coherent explanation for all of these phenomena. It's helped me enormously in my writing and my thinking about the world. So I want to leave you with the thought, you really need to read the book. I'll say this, that speech didn't give it any, it's not because of Michael's lack of articulacy. You've got to spend, I read it twice very quickly. We spent 2 or 3 days together, just sitting and talking through the ideas. I think I gave him the David Foster Wallace quote at the beginning of the book. Am I right, Michael?
You did.
He didn't attribute that. Did he attribute that? He didn't, did he?
It's in the acknowledgements.
It's in the acknowledgements. But I please read, absorb all the, the aspiring students in this room. You want to understand the world. Science is moving towards interdisciplinary thinking. You stay within your subject silo. Forgive it, it's Liam, isn't it? Forgive me, Liam, but you stay. I know that you don't believe this, but you encourage him. You stay there. Most of the problems we face are complex and interconnected. 95% of the hit papers in science, as measured by citations, are written by multidisciplinary teams, because the problems we face don't sit within the categories we impose upon the world. And so I want to encourage you, get a sense of the scope. You'll understand your areas more, I think, by having that range. You'll be able to collaborate more effectively. You'll be able to find partners to work together with, connecting your knowledge with theirs. I talk a bit about this in Liam, thank you, in Rebel Ideas, described by Michael as a masterpiece. He's probably never read it, but it's a good one. Do buy that. But look, Michael, great job. I'm going to have to...
I did read it again.
Yeah, you did. Thank you, Michael. Good luck. Buy and read the book, and encourage your fellow students to read it. We need a revolution in science. Science has done a great job. There is massive more potential for science and scientists. Drives me nuts when you go to academic institutions and people are too narrow. It's easy to want to be an expert in a small pond, hanging out with people who think in a similar way, telling you things you already know, speaking the same language. It's profoundly confining. The evidence suggests it's those who can break out in a rational way to cooperate with people with shared problems. That's when the magic happens, and Michael's book helps to unlock that. Well done.
I can't thank you enough. Thank you.
Said, he is very much appreciated, acknowledged in the acknowledgements. And he was pivotal, actually. He really helped me to convey some of these points in a way that was much more accessible. I can't thank him enough. Thank you so much for coming, Matthew.
So that brings us to the end. I mean, that was such a fascinating session. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for being here. The book is outside. I totally agree with everything Matthew said. This is a really important book at a really important time. So let's give a huge round of applause for the author, and thank you very much, Michael.
I just want to thank you all, like genuinely, thank you all so much for coming. It means so much to me, actually. I will stay out there for as long as it takes to sign any book, every book that you guys want me to sign. I just also want to thank everybody who's involved in this book, including members of my lab like Eric and Yvonne, Samaya over there, the people who aren't here, Matthew, of course, who was here, and a big thank you to my wife, Stephanie, who's here in the front. You'll see in the acknowledgement, it is gushing but accurate. She was, from every conversation that led to the different pieces of the book, all the way to reading it multiple times and giving me the space to think about it. She's just, thank you. And if you have other questions, grab me on social media, send me an email, whatever you'd like. Thank you.